So I'm very briefly going to talk about May Day. So May Day is the most widely celebrated holiday in the world. Much of it is certainly its modern version has roots here in the United States, but oddly, it's one of the only places in the world where it's not celebrated as an official holiday. So that's what the next slide has to do. I kind of get the idea that many of you know that history, so I'm going to take things in a more local and regional direction. But May Day, at least again in its most modern version, really is birthed out of the 8-hour day movement, and its most notable event is really the early part of May 1886. The lead up to May 1886, a group of working class organizations got together and decided that they had enough of working 10, 12, 14-hour days. You can imagine, the hellish version of life in the industrializing United States and the industrializing world. So workers, they looked at that and they decided, okay, 8 hours is enough. We see employers getting rich. We see the division between rich and poor getting bigger and bigger. We see the rich with mansions up on the hill. We see working class people at the bottom of the hill with the garbage running down upon them. And with all that money being made, is there really any point in working people continuing to work and slave away for 10, 12, 14-hour days? This, of course, is only 20 years after the end of official slavery, of legal slavery in the United States, as other countries around the Western Hemisphere were eliminating slavery, some of the last countries in the world, Brazil, Cuba, etc. So the idea of slavery and freedom was definitely on people's minds. And they saw work as, in many ways, the opposite of freedom. I think many people today see it that way too. I certainly do. Kind of like my job okay. But so they declared that after May 1st, 1886, they would not go back to work except under the conditions of working 8 hours per day. They came up with a slogan and signs and stickers saying 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. That was their mission, that was their demand, and on May Day, what became May Day, May 1st, 1886, hundreds of thousands of workers the country over went on strike. Strike was centered in Chicago, as it so often is, and 2 days into the strike, on May 3rd, 1886, you can probably guess where this is going. So many of these events, happen to go in this direction. May 3rd, 1886, police shot and killed several strikers at the McCormick Harvester Works in Chicago. The next day, a protest meeting held by labor organizations, held by socialists, held by anarchists in a traditional meeting place in Chicago called the Haymarket took place. As the meeting stretched into night, the crowd thinned out and it just started to rain. And at that point, a large group of police descend upon the stew. Will probably ring a bell with some people. The police descended. There it is. Thanks. So 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. That was really the demand of the labor movement at the end of the 19th century. The main demand. It's interesting, I think, that 8 hours is still, 40 hours is still the legal work week here in the United States. Because many countries kept pushing and got it down to 34, 36, 32, and in many parts of the United States, many jobs, 48 or 52 is more likely than 40. But the day after the shooting, so on May 4th, 1886, as the protest meeting gathered and as speakers talked one after another, a group of police was descending upon the strikers, descending upon the demonstrators who were listening to speeches. As the police charged at workers, somebody, we don't know who, threw a bomb. And history was changed from that point forward because police heard a bomb and they started shooting wildly. You can imagine what would happen under those circumstances. Police killed several protesters. Some police were injured. Some police were killed. But of course, you can imagine the reaction. The entire country's press, especially the press, the entire country's what were emerging as these chambers of commerce, the entire country's state apparatus descended upon the labor movement, rounded up anyone who's a suspected agitator, threw them in jail, threw them in prison, specifically in Chicago. Anarchists were really the core of the labor movement, really the dedicated core of the labor movement, were blamed for the bombing, for throwing the bomb. No one really knows who did it, but eight anarchists in Chicago were put on trial. 4 of them eventually were executed in 1887. In the years that followed, that was seen as such a travesty among working people the country over, the world over. And in country after country, they declared that from May 1st forward, that would represent International Labor Day. And one country after another took that holiday and went forward with it as Labor Day. And that's why today, May 1st, May Day, is International Labor Day. It stretches back to 1886. It also has some previous roots, but it's really a celebration of the workers demanding this 8-hour day and to commemorate those martyrs who were wrongly convicted and wrongly executed by the state. So it does have these American roots. It also has these immigrant roots because much of the labor movement was led by immigrants, something that's been true time and time again, as I'll get into here in a little bit. Turns out the local labor movement, when it was really at its peak, when it was at its strongest, when it was fighting back, when it was making demands and winning, much, if not most, of the leadership of the most people on the front lines were first and second generation immigrants. There we go. So May Day here on the harbor, and I like that phrase. That might be my favorite way of referring to this area, is just on the harbor. Title of my friend John Hughes' book, one of his books. So May Day on the harbor. As is true the world over, here, although official unions, plumbers union, electricians union, waitresses unions have always had a part, or often had a part, in planning and carrying out May Day activities. It's usually been led by what we call the labor left. So the socialists and the industrial workers of the world. So here in the lower left-hand corner was one of the larger buildings in Aberdeen for much of the 20th century. It was the Red Fin Hall, the Finnish Socialist Hall. There also was a Finnish Socialist Hall in Hope Wing. There were hundreds of socialists in Aberdeen in the early 20th century for decades. They had some positions on the city council that they used, to prevent certain types of abuses, certain types of, and support working class people in certain ways, and sometimes support strikers. These other images, this one gets used by all types of organizations now, so thank you to the Polson Museum for that one. It's one of these strike photos from 1912, from March, April 1912, during the industrial workers of the world will wobbly strike in Aberdeen and Hope Wing of lumber workers. And then down here, this one will show up again too. This building's still there. Let's see if I can do this. That's the IWW, or the Finnish IWW Hall, actually created in 1924 and remained an IWW Hall for about 2 decades. So those are really the center of the labor left, at least in the Aberdeen part of this gray and green county. But like I said, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies are really the most important organization at the front of the labor movement in the early 20th century. They were formed in 1905, but they still exist, are still fighting in many different parts of the world, including in, again, our gray and green part of the world, here in the Pacific Northwest. But they're a revolutionary industrial unionist group. They did and they do advocated forming one big union of all workers. So don't let these, little schisms of gender, of race, of ethnicity, of religion, of job title get in the way of solidarity. They wanted workers to organize across any schism and form one big union that could take on what they saw correctly was one big union of all bosses. I think that might be something, again, that we can maybe connect with today, with the tremendous solidarity shown from the employing class, from bosses. They organized all over the world, but really their strongest, they had a few real centers of strength in the United States and Canada, really where we're focused today. So black longshoremen in Philadelphia, white and black lumber workers in the post-Civil War South, and migratory farm and rail workers all over the American West. And significantly for us, thousands upon thousands of lumber workers, loggers, sawmill workers, and others, including maritime workers that handle the lumber here in the Pacific Northwest. They also organized maids, waitresses, miners, auto workers, declared the first U.S. sit-down strike in the Midwest in the 1910s. That would later be famous in the 1930s. The Wobblies engaged in a number of really famous conflicts, mostly centered around lumber workers, and on the other end of that, lumber bosses, the two sides of the saw. One side doing work and the other side getting rich. And I'm not going to talk very much about these, but they, in Everett, Washington in 1916, a little bit north of here, or a lot north of here, there was a shingle weaver strike, or shingle workers strike in the autumn of 1916, and a group of Wobblies took boats, including one called the Verona, up the Puget Sound to try to land in Everett to support their fellow workers. They, as they landed, sheriff's deputy, who had a whole gang of vigilantes, that'll be something we hear a bit about, it was vigilantes, they call from the shore, "You can't land here." From the boat, someone yells, "The hell we can't." From the shore, we hear, "Who are your leaders?" Back on the boat, you hear, "We're all leaders." And then the shooting started. Vigilantes, gunmen on the shore, gunning down workers. Bunch of them fell overboard and died. At least 5, bodies were discovered, but many more drowned and were just lost. When this too will maybe ring a bell, when the Wobblies got back to Seattle, they were arrested for firing back. So this sort of gunman vigilantism is sort of at the core of the anti-IWW activities, anti-labor activities across the country. The United States has the most violent labor history in certainly in the Western world, and it is the most privatized labor history. So union busting in the United States mostly happens from private organizations. Europe, it's when they were busting unions at the worst, it was usually the government. In the United States, it's very much privatized. But to deal with the IWW, employers, police, strikebreakers, others used a few methods. One was to simply round them up and kick them out. That happened in Bisbee, Arizona, famously. It also happened in Raymond. It happened in Aberdeen. Probably the one that maybe is the most interesting is in Raymond. In 1912, there was a strike of lumber workers. The bosses and the police rounded up all the strikers, sent the Greeks on a train car up to Seattle, and shipped the Finns, who were the largest striking group, down to Astoria. So they just uprooted the strikers and kicked them out of town. They do that time and time again. They also destroy halls, and on occasion, they just straight up murder strikers. If beating doesn't work, if arrests don't work, if deportations don't work, how about murder? And in a few cases, employers, vigilantes, etc., murder. Murder wobblies. Probably the most famous event maybe in the entire history of Southwest Washington, or probably in history of Lewis County, is Armistice Day 1919 in Centralia, where another band of vigilantes, this time veterans from the American Legion, raided an IWW hall. It was one of the many times IWW halls were raided. The IWW, when their hall got raided, they fired, killed some of the vigilantes for raiding the hall. Those who didn't get injured, those who didn't get killed, then chased down, beat up, tortured a bunch of wobblies, dragged them to prison, dragged them to jail, held them in jail, and then dragged one of them, Wesley Everest, very famous image of him, dragged him out, tortured, threw his body over the bridge a few times, filled it full of bullets, pulled him back up, threw him over again, mutilated him, destroyed his body. And then those who defended their hall were put in prison in Walla Walla, sentenced to prison sentences between 15 and 25 years. Once again, this seems to have a pattern, right? Is violence against strikers, and if they happen to defend themselves, they are going to be prosecuted, they are going to be imprisoned, and the like. But this little corner of the world, Aberdeen, Hookham, has a bit of a special history because it's a center of labor history, yes, it's a center of left-wing history, but above all else, in many ways, it's a center of employer history, a center of boss history, a center of boss activism, as bosses time and again collaborated, cooperated, and formed what's sometimes called a union against unions. We see this throughout this region's history. Anytime workers organize, anytime they strike, anytime they demonstrate, bosses get together through the Chamber of Commerce 100 years ago, through the Elks Club, through other organizations, and use those organizations to attack. And their real solidarity is, in many ways, their main word there. Violence. They so often use violence, as you can see here. This image from the industrial worker showing the map. It says the master's hand, the lumber truss, and this is supposed to be a police officer beating an IWW over the head. That slightly misses the mark, though, because at least in this area, the police were a part of it, but quite often it was the employers themselves who formed vigilante organizations to attack workers. this was so common that this region got nicknamed Axe Handleville because employers so often use axe handles to attack workers. The most notable of the early, one of the more notable, at least, of these labor conflicts happens in 1911 during the Aberdeen free speech fight, when local Wobblies, Aberdeen Wobblies and Poquim Wobblies, organized on the streets in downtown Aberdeen and beyond that. The city fathers and all their respectable wisdom decide to ban street speaking, but they only enforce it against certain groups. They don't enforce it against religious groups. They only enforce it against radical political groups. So what I'm saying probably wouldn't go over real well. And for anytime a worker violated that law, they would be hauled into jail. Well, rather than going through the expensive process and lengthy process of doing individual trials, what the Aberdeen employers did, organized through the Elks, organized through the Chamber of Commerce, was form a vigilante committee called the Citizens Committee. These were formed all over the country, and they were bosses' vigilante clubs. That's exactly what they were. And what they did was, in Aberdeen, they rounded the free speech fighters up, the Wobblies up, and they took them out of town. They evicted them from town, put them on a train car, and said, God bless you if you leave, but God help you if you return. Pretty good thread there. That conflict continued until the early weeks of 1912, when the Wobblies just kept bringing more and more people to the streets, kept challenging the law, that eventually the bosses gave up, and they got rid of the street speaking prohibition. But the bosses also learned a lesson. They learned that they could be very powerful acting together, acting violently, and using direct action against the workers. And they'll do that time and again. If you think I'm full of hot air, this guy was the head of the Chamber of Commerce, the head of the largest bank in Aberdeen, and widely seen as the wealthiest person in Southwest Washington. Some years later, he was interviewed and said this about those heady days of 1911, 1912. He said, quote, "We organized that night a vigilante committee, a citizens committee, I think we called it, to put down the strike by intimidation and force. We got hundreds of heavy clubs of the weight and size of pick handles, armed our vigilantes with them, and that night raided all the IWW headquarters, rounded up as many of them as we could, and escorted them out of town." He was later sentenced to prison for financial crimes for very short, but this obviously, he was fine. Yeah, I mean, murder, killing. I guess he didn't directly murder him, but he beat up him. Cool. That was the free speech fight that I just talked about. Right after that is the 1912 lumber strike that really starts in Poquim, right here, spread to Aberdeen, spread to Pacific County, spread to the logging camps all over Western Washington. After about a month of lumber workers, who were all men, got tired of being again beaten, evicted from the area. Their wives, their daughters, their mothers, their female acquaintances took to the picket lines, thinking perhaps that the vigilantes wouldn't treat them the same way. They were wrong, and actually, thankfully, the Seattle Star sent down some photographers because the local newspapers were not ever going to give the strikers' side of the story, the IWW side of the story. But the Seattle Star fortunately took some photos, including of this woman named Minnie Randa. Most of them were Finns, like her, but a lot of them were beaten. A lot of them had to seek treatment for their violence. That strike it was in the newspapers. So the Washingtonian in Hooker, the Daily World in Aberdeen, the Aberdeen Herald, the Grays Harbor Post also in Aberdeen. They called it the Greek strike. They used that language in part to divide the strikers. There were thousands of strikers. Turns out there weren't thousands of Greeks. They called it the Greek strike because they wanted to, and they would say things like, oh, it's a strike of black Greeks and Italians, those Southern Europeans. They're different from you, good, respectable, native-born white Americans. So they tried, newspapers especially, tried to divide and conquer the strikers. Again, this happens time and time again. It's their tricks. Since we are in Oakland, at least I think we are, here's one of our mayors. He was briefly a mayor. This man named Harry Ferguson was a preacher elected mayor shortly after women won the right to vote in Washington State in 1910. He's the first mayor in Washington, or in Oakland after that, and he was seen as a bit of a reformer. Well, during the 1912 strike, he tried to intervene, and he tried to make it so the police would not cooperate with the vigilantes in attacking the strikers. Want to guess how that went for him? So, local employers organized, again, around the Chamber of Commerce. They ousted him. They ran a recall election against him. He lost his job, lost his position as mayor, and he then went over to what he maybe would have seen as the right side. He became a socialist. Obviously we can't change the system from within, so let's try third party. That's what he did. It's interesting because not long after the 2020 demonstrations, something very similar happened in Seattle with the Chamber of Commerce, with the Republicans and the Democrats uniting to oust Kashama Sawant. They fortunately failed, but they ran a recall campaign against her. Same thing happens in Camas during the 1910s. I forget the year exactly, but a mayor there supported the strikers, so they were recalled. It happens time and again. I'm going to kind of quickly get through this part, but hall raids. This is a central part of the anti-labor experience, the anti-IWW experience. I mentioned the Centralia raid a few minutes ago. Well, it's true, halls in Centralia were raided, halls in Seattle were raided, but here, Aberdeen and Hoquiam, they were raided 12 times between 1911 and 1922. Basically, almost one a year. Anytime the IWW would start having a meeting place, their halls would be raided, their materials would be destroyed, their members would be rounded up. If it's before 1919, they'd usually be charged with vagrancy, the crime of living, the crime of being a person on the streets. After 1919, they had more, they had criminalized the IWW. Let's see. At least 12 times in these two towns. At really the center of this whole, I've mentioned newspapers a few times, but they play such an important role in anti-labor activity because they play this important role in dividing and conquering the working class. They do that by referring to strikers in a certain way. They'll say they are outside agitators. That's one of their favorite terms. I guess there was a zine not long ago called Outside Agitator, my favorite way of referring to activists. Southern bigots called Martin Luther King an outside agitator. It's been the way to attack activists since time out of mind, since the word outside agitators were invented. Also referring to them as violent criminals, doing everything possible to other activists. They are violent, they're criminals, they're drug addicts, they're they're prostitutes. They're everything wrong. Newspapers play such an important role in doing this to the IWW, to the Socialist Party, later to the Communist Party, and on and on and on. I'm a historian, but maybe that happens today. I don't know. But just to see how central this region that we're in is, this is the Industrial Worker, published in Seattle, but really a national IWW journal with thousands upon thousands of subscribers and far more readers. Right here, their May Day issue. Happy May Day. They're focused on Grace Harbor on their front page. It says their slogan is solidarity. Mill strikers in fight to a finish. Thugs get a bonus for slugging men. That was after really 6 months of continued activity between the free speech right of 1911 and the strike of 1912. Bad news. Again, newspapers and politicians, they were not shy. They did not, lurk about. They were very honest in what they were doing in their anti-labor attacks. You see here, the Literary Digest, New York Sun. This is published in newspaper after newspaper, this article called Rooting Out the Reds. And in places like Aberdeen, Coquitlam, Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, BC, etc., this is really important because the left, the labor left, is so rooted in the area, particularly among immigrant workers in this area, among Finns, Croatians, some others, but particularly them, that they are very honest about. We have to root them out. We have to dig them out. We have to get. It's going to be a sustained campaign because we need to get them out of here. Here's one that you probably have heard a bit about in recent history because the Pinkertons still exist. Probably the most infamous corporation in American history are the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. They're labor spies. They're anti-labor organizations organized in the 19th century, and essentially they did a few things. They provided strikebreakers that were just the muscle. They would often go get retired football players, retired wrestlers, etc., former college football players, workers out on their luck, unemployed workers, to break strikes. But the other thing they did that was so important was they had spies. They had a spy network. So basically every labor and left-wing organization in the country had spies, and they would report to bosses. They would report to the owners of the company on the goings-on of those organizations. I've read thousands of these. The United States government organized them. The Washington State government created one called the Washington State Secret Service. Not that long ago, it actually happened after the invasion of Iraq. It happened here in Washington State. Perhaps some of you remember that. There was a democracy now special about it. But so the government did it and private corporations did it. And then the city of Aberdeen was like, let's do both. So they 1911, right before the Aberdeen free speech fight, they hired a man named Templeman. They hired him, the city government did, and had him. He was a spy from the Field Detective Agency, which is really the Western branch, or Western version of the Pinkertons, and had him be the chief of police. So a labor spy doing double duty as chief of police was the main public strikebreaker in Aberdeen, Coquitlam. Can't make this stuff up. So you can imagine how this went. Of course, World War I is right there, not long after the time period that I'm talking about. The United States enters World War I in 1917, is actively fighting for about a year. And the Wobblies, especially individual Wobblies, were very dedicated, anti-imperialist, pacifist, etc., anti-militarist. And what they said, very similar to what the socialists said, what many other organizations said, was something that'll probably ring a bell here, is that the wars benefit the rich. Workers die so that the rich can get richer. It's a war for weapons manufacturers. It's a war for empire. This was not an unusual perspective. Groups the world over were saying much the same thing. Probably more importantly, though, sorry for all the text, is in this area, this isn't directly related to the war, but war manufacturers needed Douglas fir, they needed spruce, and the Olympic Peninsula, the Cascades, etc., were full of trees. And during the war, led by Wobblies, but also non-Wobblies, also AFL unionists, standard trade unionists, went on strike to demand the 8-hour day, demand some basic life improvements. Well, that didn't go over real well. They also, anytime the IWW does something, they print these stickers. They call them silent agitators. They have these wonderful cartoons they print. And they also criticize the war in poetry, in posters, and the like. Well, to deal with that, the Washington State and United States government sends in strikebreakers. They create a company military union, called the Loyal Legion of Loggers and Lumbermen. Basically, they create a company union run by the federal government to break the strike. It works. Not only that, they tar and feather a number of Wobblies, they beat a number of Wobblies, and they break the strike, but they grant the 8-hour day. The pressure worked. Going on strike, thousands, tens of thousands of lumber workers go on strike. Many of them paid with their freedom, many of them paid with, black eyes and broken ribs, but they won the 8-hour day. Can't really see that, but probably heard of the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The Espionage Act has been rolled out by the U.S. government again in the last few decades. Probably have heard of Julian Assange. But in its original use, it was used to attack socialists, pacifists, and Wobblies. And a number of labor activists were sentenced to long prison terms for criticizing the war, doing what I'm doing. Probably were more articulate. Might have been more interesting. Taller, better looking, funnier, better hair. But here's where I'm really going to get into this, and this is how I'm going to finish it, is in Washington State, in Oregon, in Idaho, and more than half of the other states. State governments passed legislation criminalizing belonging to the IWW. These are called criminal syndicalism laws. They made an ism illegal. And that ism was widely seen as being the ism of the IWW. There are often, there's debates about it, whatever, that they were syndicalists or some other type of ideology. What matters right now, at least what I think matters right now, is that belonging to the IWW, especially being active, was made a criminal offense. Governor Ernest Lister had this to say. He actually vetoes the law the first time in 1917. He thought it was so extreme, and then goes into effect in 1990. But it's passed in Oregon and Idaho in 1917. Anyway, he said this is the governor. By its advocates, it is hoped that its enactment into law will bring about the elimination of the doctrines advocated by members of an organization known as the Industrial Workers of the World from the state, and makes it a felony to discuss or advocate such doctrines. So, in this state that had the most Wobblies, tens of thousands, this region, this county that had thousands of Wobblies, this made it illegal to belong to that organization. And Lister, like I said, created a spy agency. This was the Secret Service. They had spies. Number 31, they just went by numbers. There were two others running around Aberdeen, Hookland. I've got, the State Archives has the reports. I have the reports. All very clear cut. They spied on workers. They spied on Germans. They spied on lots of organizations. Very dangerous to be German. To speak German. Even teachers would get in trouble, would be fired if they had a German last name. They also, in Washington State, passed the red flag law. If you Google this, some stuff about guns will come up, but this is different. This just made it a felony to display a flag of the socialist. Socialist, anarchist, So, anyway, it was an extremely anti-labor legislature in the late 1910s, in the midst of the war, right? We've lived through some wars, turns out. We know just when the drums of war are being beat, that people's passions, legislators' passions, they'll pass all kinds of laws, Patriot Act and other laws to make it easier to spy on people, make it harder to protest, and on and on. The Washington State Legislature, the largest lobbying group were lumbermen. They were the largest employers. They were the largest bosses. Like they've said, people have said Patty Murray is the senator from Boeing. These are the senators and representatives, state level, from Weyerhaeuser, from Holst, from Anderson and Middleton, from S.E. Slade, from all those companies. More specifically, here we have some friends from Southwest Washington. Alex Polson, president of the Polson Lumber Company, said this about the law: the criminal syndicalism bill is a sabotage bill, and one which nearly everyone except the IWWs are in favor of. From Centralia, F.B. Hubbard: we do not believe this law will work a hardship on loyal American citizens. And down here, another one. Another company sent a telegram: confidence will be in great measure restored in the minds of our Eastern investors if we pass this law. I have at my house dozens upon dozens of letters written from every single lumber company in Aberdeen and Hoquiam and Cosmopolis, etc., to the governor advocating passing this law. Yeah. And who paid? Who paid the price?
Thank you.
Workers paid the price. Hundreds of wobblies were arrested. What? Men, women, immigrant, native-born, people working as waitresses at the logging camps, people working as sailors. They were all rounded up. This was really the center of it in Aberdeen and Brooklyn. Here's some more. This Emil Gustafson, John Nafwa, and Matt Sila, immigrants, two of them Finns, one of them might be Finn, might be Swede Finns. See, here, this guy is probably the most famous local wobbly. He was sort of local. He was C.E. Stumpy Kane, was from Eastern Washington. Well, spent much of his life in Eastern Washington, but he was an IWW reporter and editor of the Industrial Worker. He came through here and wrote many of the articles about the Grays Harbor IWW. It's because of him that we have much of this history. First Amendment right for his writing about the IWW. He went to prison in Walla Walla State Penitentiary for quite some time. So these people are in prison in the late 1910s and early 1920s, and that's where this story really is about to come to a close, because May Day 1923, hundreds of Wobblies and other political prisoners were in jails and prisons the country over. The Wobblies did not like lobbying, they did not like begging politicians, they liked using
their status as workers, their potential power as workers to achieve change. Rather than going through a politician, why not, demand change and strike and bring it about? So they declared, much like the Chicago 8-hour day strikers had 40 years earlier, that on May 1st, 1923, May Day, that they would go on strike and demand the liberation of all of the country's what they called class 4 prisoners, political prisoners. Here's one of the strikes. That's from San Pedro. That's California. That's one of the other real centers of the strike. But it's really the lumber industry, the loggers, sawmill workers in the Pacific Northwest, where the strike has its greatest hold, where thousands of workers go on strike. Again, not so much for themselves, but to demand the liberation of others. One of the strikers was a man named William McKay, who I've been pretty interested in for a while. He, according to the sources that were passed down by his friends, he was Irish-born logger who had become active in the IWW in British Columbia and Canada, had been blacklisted, not allowed to work in Canada because of his activism in the IWW. So he's in Aberdeen, he's living in Aberdeen and Coquitlam in 1923. He goes on strike. He's part of the strike force that convinces the workers at the Race Harbor Commercial Company in Cosmopolis. So notorious was that place that it was often called the Western Penitentiary by labor activists. It was seen as the most exploitative lumber mill in the country in many ways. The Washington State Legislature ran all these had all these investigations into it because of their exploitative practices. It's over there in Coquitlam, or Cosmopolis, where the mill is. Our mill. So he was picketing after they got workers at the commercial company to join them. They marched to the Bay City lumber mill that had been created in 1914. It had been the Union mill over there in South Aberdeen. It's not out at Bay City, it's South Aberdeen. And there he was picketing, and he was met by lumber company gunmen. Almost all the lumber companies hired gunmen to protect their property, and of course they had guns, gunmen. And McKay and the gunman, whose name was E.I. Green, got into a dispute. Green yelled something bigoted at him about how only foreigners would believe in this stuff. They got into a confrontation. Green pulled out a gun. McKay ran. Green shot him in the head and murdered him. May 8th, 1923, so again, about a century ago, workers came out in force. Thousands of workers from all over, certainly at least the Northwest, came to Aberdeen to march through downtown. A downtown that, by the way, had just witnessed, a decade of roundups, a decade of workers being attacked, and only a few days earlier, the unpunished murder of one of their fellow activists. You see here men, women, children marching side by side, ending up at the cemetery. I actually have, because I've written a bit about this, I've met some of the grandkids and kids of these people, which is kind of exciting. Mostly they were Finns, no surprise. Many of these materials, actually, I found when I was working and researching in Finland. This one only exists there. I guess I changed that by putting it online a million times. But a lot of Finnish language newspapers had articles about this, far more than in the U.S. But I like this image very much because it really returns to that first Utah Phillips line, and I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge because this is the first time that anyone has talked about William McKay in public in 100 years, as far as I know. This is the first time that we have looked back on his life and his struggles, that But we have looked at this sign that says, fellow worker McKay, murdered at Bay City Mill by a company gunman May 3rd, 1923. A victim of capitalist greed. We never forget. And for years, I thought that was like a stylized exclamation point. But it's definitely a question asking us if we're going to forget the strike, if we're going to forget the political prisoners, if we're going to forget William McKay and his life that he paid, or that he paid with, or are we going to remember? Are we going to talk about him? Are we going to commemorate his struggles, or are we going to think about these as we try to move into the future? This was not the end of the IWW in the region. In fact, a year and a half later, they opened this massive hall in Aberdeen. And when they opened it, they ran this poem was published in Finnish. I got it translated, but here's what it has to say, and see if it maybe rings a bell. It resonates. We demand freedom for slaves, even if we must purchase it with blood. Wonder if the chest filled with glee endure. When the moment of freedom arrives, when the cold chains of the slave are broken, and our victory journey is begun. Thus, welcome children of oppression, beginners of a new era, young and the gray-haired, carriers of a heavy load. Welcome 1,000 times. Well, I think that's two different photos, I guess, two different points. So this is where I'll leave it there, just because I think it's an important lesson, an important thing to think about is this sign may be a challenge. Certainly to me, this is my job. But maybe to the wider community too. So, thank you.